Hi, I'm Ellen Halliday, Deputy Editor of Prospect. You're about to watch the interview portion of the latest episode of the Prospect podcast with this week's special guest. For the full episode with additional discussion from Prospect Senior Editor Alona Ferber and myself, click the link in the description below to listen via your favourite podcast app. And if you'd like to read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, visit prospectmagazine.co.uk. So, Peter, thank you very much for coming down to Prospect HQ. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me.
Before we get into your work proper, I feel like I do have to get this off my chest. We were talking before we started. I think the first bit of your journalistic work that I was aware of was not, in fact, your very worthy 2014 book on the Scottish independence referendum, but another thing you did that year, which was this Journey of a Lifetime radio documentary where you travelled to Mongolia and learned to wrestle.
I'm so pleased you're asking me about this. It was so much fun. Yeah, so basically every year, and I think it still exists, the Royal Geographical Society has a thing called a Journey of a Lifetime. And you put in ideas, anyone in the public can do it, and the winning entry gets to make a Radio 4 documentary. So they send you off to where. And I'd recently, a friend of mine's brother, a very classic Irish story, out in a pint in London. And I was out with a friend of mine, his brother, and his brother was in the extractive industries and mining. And he'd just come back from Mongolia, and he was telling me the story. At the time, it's called Oyotoge. It's the biggest, I guess, a big and open cast mine in the world is in Mongolia. It's huge. And he's telling me all about it. I was like, that's so interesting. I was like, how could I go there? I thought about this idea and I went, okay, what about learning how to wrestle as a way to go to Mongolia to tell the story about how it's changed? And so I went to Mongolia and spent about a month living with a group of wrestlers. And the funny thing was, like, the wrestlers were all they're very body conscious so they're always looking at each other's bodies, they're always chatting to each other, And I arrived like this little weedy Irish guy. I was like, oh no. And then they kept on staring at my legs. I was like, what's going on? I'm so white, what's going on? And at the time I was running a lot, so these big calves. And then one of them told me in broken English, like, we've called you horse because of your calves. And when I left the wrestling, when I left the tent and I left the wrestling camp, the guy who was in charge of the camp, he said to me, Peter, your brain is up here, and he lifts his head up high, but your body is down here. And he put his hand really low, and he goes, when I next see you, I want them to be level. Thankfully, I've actually never ran into him since. I still have nightmares. No, I've never run into him just in the shops or something. He's gone, Peter, what's happened to you?
Yeah, well, I mean, have your wrestling skills stayed with you? Is that so?
I still have one move.
Nice. Okay.
I've got one move that I know how to do.
We won't embarrass you by asking you to do it on camera for the listeners. That's okay. We'll leave that for another time. You come back to the podcast.
Yeah. Well, anyway, sorry for taking you down that little diversion, but I guess people can probably still go and listen to it.
You can still Google it, and if you Google it, there's actually pictures of me too, and one of which, the way it's taken, I'm learning how to wrestle. It does look like both me and the other guy are naked. So it's quite a striking image. It's still on the BBC website.
Okay, nice, great. Okay, well, moving on from Mongolian wrestling. More recently, you've been focusing on British democracy, corruption, very, very different topics. And you now have a Substack, which has the same title as your book from a few years ago called Democracy for Sale. I'd love to know what made you start to think that British democracy was for sale. Where did this kind of interest arise, and how do you kind of get into this body of work?
So it's not a subject I would never have thought that I was going to spend so many years. It's now been about 6 or 7 years writing about this subject. It was really fortuitous. I was started back in 2016. I was working as a stringer for the Irish Times. I just finished doing some stuff for Channel 4, and I was covering the Brexit referendum. And I was in Sunderland a couple of days before the referendum. And I was getting the train, the Metro, back from Sunderland. And there was a copy of the Free Sheet, the newspaper Metro. And there was a big advert on the front which said, take back control. Do you remember the Vote League slogan from all those years ago? And on the back, I looked at it, and on the back was a logo of the DUP, of the Democratic Unionist Party. And it said, paid for and distributed on behalf of the DUP. And I used to work in Belfast. And I was like, what this is so strange. What are DUP doing advertising, in Sunderland? In Sunderland. But I also knew that political donations in Northern Ireland were secret. So I thought, okay, that's quite interesting. And I took a picture of it and stuck it on Twitter. Back in the days when Twitter was useful. So this is, this really is the dim and distant past. And I sent a tweet about it. I kind of forgot about it. And about 6 months later, Adam Ramsey, who was then at Open Democracy, got in touch, said, I saw this tweet of yours. I'm writing this piece about the DUP and Brexit because he'd seen in Edinburgh some similar stuff paid for by the DUP. Do you want to work together on it? So the two of us started working on it. We did this big story. We figured out that they must have spent at least £250,000. We figured out where some of the money came from. And it just opened up a kind of rabbit hole. The two of us started, the story just kind of got crazier and crazier. We found out that the person the money had passed through was a former Conservative Party candidate, general election candidate, who'd been in business with a Danish gunrunner and the head of Saudi intelligence. It was kind of like an airport novel. It was totally crazy. So I started doing all these stories. I ended up going to work for Open Democracy. And we kept on doing that story. But then I started, partly because I hadn't really written about these issues before, and probably because I wasn't a Westminster lobby correspondent, I started becoming really interested in lots of other stuff. I saw, at the time, this was just after Brexit referendum, and there was all these think tanks, so the Legatum Institute becoming really common and popular. I was like, who are these people? And I'm from very close to the Irish border, so there was a lot of, frankly, nonsense being talked about that issue. I was like, how does this operate? How do these people who seem to know nothing about what they're talking about end up on television? So I kind of got caught in that, a lot of that stuff. I'd covered also after the Brexit referendum, I'd been in the States covering the presidential election. So I'd spent about a month traveling around America. So I'd also started the kind of inklings of what was happening, say, with Cambridge Analytica and Facebook, and it was the first online election. So all that stuff I was fascinated by. And so then I just started, I found myself writing more and more about these subjects and kind of getting really drawn into this question that I'd never really asked before, which is, how does access to British democracy work?
And before we we wanted to make sure that it's really clear for listeners what we're even talking about. So you slightly alluded to what this is now in your question, but when you say dark money, what exactly do you mean? And when you say democracy is for sale, is it really for sale? Do you literally mean that? What do you mean?
These are good questions. And dark money became like a kind of catch-all for all of this stuff. But really what dark money means, and it's kind of useful to pull these things apart. Dark money as a phrase really comes from Jane Meyer's book of the same name, the New Yorker journalist, who's fantastic. She's really fantastic on these issues. She's a great new book out about the Supreme Court, and she's brilliant at charting. I think something I try to chart too, because I see what's happening in America, is the influence of money in our politics. And a big part of that in America is what we call dark money, which is basically any money you can't see that gets into the political system. So money that has an influence that you can't see. The DUP donation's a very obvious bit where you just don't know where the money came from. So we still don't know. I wrote an entire book. So if anyone listening to this knows where it came from, do give me a shot. I'd still love to know. That's one example. That's quite an unusual example. The other is things like anonymously funded think tanks who don't declare their donors. So they can end up on television pushing talking points. Liz Truss being the big example of that in the Institute of Economic Affairs. But also things like, advertising online. There's still ways to give money anonymously into British politics. There's things what are called unincorporated associations, which is basically a kind of almost legal fictions, which allow you to give money into politics without knowing who's giving the money. So all of those different routes are kind of dark money. And when I talk about democracy for sale, I think I'm broadening it out more to asking about how do you buy influence in politics. And one of the things I became interested in really early in doing this sort of work was I kind of noticed that the political economy of politics is quite small, actually. There's not that much money that runs around it. Like we're here in the middle of Westminster. There's a few other little bits of brass plaques outside of a few other places here in and around Westminster. There's not actually that much. Like compared to, say, if you go to America, go to K Street in Washington, there's these huge, big glass and steel buildings from the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute, the Brookings Institution. All of these, there's a big political economy in the States. And when I first started doing this work, I was like, well, actually, maybe Britain's not that interesting because there's not as much money. In America, there's huge amounts of money. Like £50,000, which is the amount of money to get into the Conservative Leaders Group, where you'd have dinner with the Prime Minister 4 times a year. £50,000 in the States, $60,000 get you nowhere. But once I started doing this work, and I think it's what's been kind of borne out by some of the stuff that's happening over the last few years, I realised that actually, because there's so little money and everyone's kind of chasing this small money in the small political economy, it can actually give you much more influence. And you can end up with these crazy stories about, like, you know, the story of Richard Desmond and Robert Jenrick, where Richard Desmond, the property developer, is sitting next to Robert Jenrick, the housing minister, the Tory function. He's paid £12,000 for the whole table. He gets to show him, he shows him videos on his phone of this new development, but the development is going to get hit by this tax from Tower Hamlets, this big new housing project. So Robert Jenrick then calls it in, and the decision is changed. You know, and that was a story a couple of years ago. But that's a really good example, I think, of how small amounts of money, and I think that's what I mean by democracy for sale. This sense where we have unequal access. Some people are able to access our politics, and some people aren't.
Yeah. I mean, I think we should also probably note that a lot of what you're talking about, you're saying is it's stuff that's allowed. This is not like illegal behavior. It's kind of all within the rules. So, I mean, is the problem the fact that this is allowed, or is it a corruption of something that actually could operate okay, but somehow has got out of hand?
Well, this is a big aspect of it. When I was writing my book, I kind of, narratively, I was like, because there's some certain point as a journalist, so you're writing a story and halfway down you read no rules have been broken, and you're a bit like, okay, why did I bother reading this story in a way? There's no suggestion of any wrongdoing. And actually, narratively, I felt like when I was writing my book, I started to turn on the head and go, like, and you're allowed to do this in a book and you can't do this in a news article or different conventions. You can go, and would you believe this is all totally fine? And narratively, that's actually quite powerful. People go, wow, that's mad. And I think that's my big point with this. Very rarely, like occasionally I write about stuff. And a story this a couple of weeks ago on my Substack that I was like, people are accused of a rule breach. And occasionally there is an accusation that a rule has been breached somewhere. But often it's not. Often these things are all within the rules. And I think that's my big issue with this, actually. Our rules on politics. You take lobbying, for example. Transparency International reckons that about 4% of lobbying is captured by the lobbying register, by the lobbying laws that David Cameron brought in. 4%, that's 96% isn't.
And just to clarify for listeners, under those regulations, if you're a lobbyist, you must register as an accredited lobbyist. You
must register an accredited lobbyist, but only if you're lobbying government ministers and are very senior civil servants. If you're an in-house lobbyist, you don't have to register. So David Cameron broke absolutely no rules by texting all his mates, trying to get them to do stuff for Lex Greensill, even though David Cameron had a multi-million-pound stake in Greensill's company. No rules were broken. The Greensill scandal is quite interesting to go back over. I find myself doing that quite a lot. It's going back over stories that happen. And if you go back over, that was a story we all talked about 2 years ago. And actually, if you go back, and there was a series of parliamentary inquiries, most of which suggested loads more rules, but no rules were broken, actually. And that is a common point about what I do and what I look at. Actually, it's often that the problem is, you know, we don't really have many rules at all in a lot of these things. You can give unlimited amounts to political parties. In some ways, we kind of have the worst of all worlds. On the continent, it's mainly state funding. There's very tight caps on spending and on money in politics in most continental Europe. In America, there's no caps, but it actually is a very transparent system. In Britain, we have kind of the worst of all worlds. We don't have a very transparent system, but we also have no caps on the amount of money that you can give.
What kind of interests, like in this small political economy in Britain, what are the interests that are behind the dark money in the UK? What do they want? What have you uncovered in your work?
I think that's really interesting. I think that shifts depending on where things are at. Like when I started doing this work, Brexit was a really interesting lens to look at this through. Like my book, Democracy for Sale, was very much written in the context of Brexit. It was written, you know, under a crazy deadline right in the middle of Brexit, you know, in the run up in kind of mid 2019 up to the start of 2020. And at that point, you actually had really interesting things happen because historically, you will often get people who want specific policy outcomes. So at the moment, we're talking a lot about, say, Keir Starmer and the Premier League, which I do think is a problem. All these football tickets, because the Premier League does not want the football regulator. That compromises the government's position. That was a previous government's position as well. They wanted a football regulator. That's a problem. It's very specific. Yeah. With Brexit, you had a very different thing. A lot of people who wanted actually a sea change. They wanted a very different environment. They wanted massive shrinking of state, massive anti-deregulation. We're often less interested. Sometimes they were interested in specific policy outcomes. And it's one of the reasons you saw a lot of new people donating to politics. So if you look at the money, say, behind the Brexit referendum, it really kind of bifurcated, particularly the Conservatives, because you had the old financiers who often gave money to politics all back to the Remain campaign. And you had a lot of hedge fund people and people like Aaron Banks who've backed the Leave campaign. So Brexit was quite an interesting lens because you could see that what was being influenced was less a specific narrow policy outcome and more an agenda. In general, what you see actually in Britain is more an attempt actually to do the second, is around specific policy outcomes. Historically, the property sector, for example, has always given lots of money to whoever's in power. Because it's where the most money is to be made. You know, like you can make huge amounts of money from property, from small decisions, even and often at a local level. And so it kind of depends what the political contours of the moment are, I think, depending on what you're trying to do. Doesn't mean, though, I do still think you can see after Brexit, especially on the Conservative right and people who funded parties that have no hope of getting near government, a sense that they do actually are trying to change the wider mood music, which is what's happened in America. American political funding has gone from that quite transactional funding 20 years ago to now being way more about sea change, especially on the Conservative side, way more about a broader, actually, like Overton window shifting.
You mentioned kind of the Premier League and the discussion around, well, basically the sort of series of issues that Labour's run into. There have been a bunch of stories there. I'd love to know what you think about which ones matter and which ones are just noise, because there seems to be a kind of a scale from like, you know, the more serious to maybe something that's a distraction. I'd love to know what you think sits where.
I think it's really fascinating, and I think what we've seen, like I must admit, back in July when the election was called, I was almost like, okay, I can kind of put some of that work I've been doing on hold. I'll do more work. I do a lot of work as well around the environment. I'm very interested in lobbying around environmental issues. I'm very interested in that space too, in the kind of wider influence world. Almost wherever there's money, I'm interested in that. And it's okay, I'll be doing a lot more of that. It'll be a lot less about politics and donations because, you know, Labour and power, you know, I think a lot of people did think that we'd stop talking about it.
I mean, it was part of the pitch to the public, right? Was to say, we're honest, we're going to
do that sort of thing.
We're going to do our best, etc. So, yeah.
And it was in the manifesto as well. If you look at it, we're going to end the chaos of sleaze, etc., etc. It was a big thing. And I think what's been kind of fascinating about it is I think on one level, Labour just haven't realised, they've been really slow to realise that people don't, like if you look at we've got really low trust in politics in Britain. We're not alone, but we do have. And one of the issues that we had is we had a lot of scandals over the last few years. And I think there's been a real failure to understand the public mood and also understand the sense where people do ask legitimately, what do people get from this? And Labour, I wrote a really long piece for the LRB that came out just not long after the election. I spent a good bit of time researching it before the election, which is all about these issues. And at the time, I was kind of writing in the piece that if Labour doesn't get a handle on this, this could be an issue, say, in a year's time. This is a problem for Labour. And I was looking at things like the secondments from big businesses to Labour, the donations, this sense that Labour was actually becoming quite captured by a small group of interests and why that was a problem. And especially because, and as I wrote in the piece, actually, there was two big issues, I thought. One was Labour, I think Starmer and the top team really struggled to see, because they see themselves as good people, you know, and I'm not saying they're bad people, they see themselves as good people. They struggled to see the conflict between private interests and public office. And related to that, I think it's particularly pronounced when it comes to people that they see as from quote unquote the Labour family. And you can see that with Wahid Ali, because they really felt like this is a good guy. He's one of our mates. He's not a PPE COVID contract guy. He's not looking to get large amounts of money. And I think the problem was where the public can see, well, actually, this is potential conflicts of interest. These are people who have interests and you have put yourself in a compromised position. I think they're the things I particularly are problematic with.
We should possibly just remind listeners what that kind of, where that conflict came about. Yeah,
or what the conflict is almost. And I think this, well, actually, it's worth remembering. I think like this is where it almost cuts to the heart of it. I mentioned this in my piece in Unreviewed Books, was that the stuff about Starmer and donations wasn't new. The Financial Times did a piece about it back in, I think, June, July, about he'd taken more free gifts than anybody else. And at the time, Starmer said something really interesting. He said, no, there's no conflict of interest because it's all registered. It's all declared. That's not how conflicts of interest work. That's a mitigating factor. It's transparency. You publish it so I can see it, you can see it, you're a journalist, you can ask a question. Doesn't mean the conflict doesn't exist. The conflict still exists. It's just an attempt to mitigate. It's important and it should exist. And I think that's the problem for Starmer. He's not seemed to see how, okay, take Wahid Ali, right, is giving him his glasses. That looks bad, I think, yeah. But what's in some ways, I think, the most problematic bit of that is that somebody who's worked in Wahid Ali's office was seconded to work on Labour's campaign and involved in things like candidate selection. That's problematic. That's a big issue. Similarly, with free tickets to the football, people go, okay, yes, it's hard for Keir Starmer to go to the football. But what happens when, as is now, the Premier League are lobbying the government not to do something? That puts the government in a compromised position because it's having to think about optics. Before it thinks about what's the right decision, it's having to go, oh, if we do this, will it look as if we've been influenced, etc., etc. So it creates a conflict, and that's exactly it. And humans we're not able to split our brains. And I think that's the problem with this with some of the kind of conversation around this. Oh, it doesn't influence me, it doesn't make any difference, etc. Frankly, if you spend any time talking to anybody for an hour, they influence. I get influence. I talk to loads of lobbyists. They influence me. I find it has a bit of a penumbra. For the day afterwards, I find myself and then after time, it kind of has a half-life to it. Starts to fade away. But that's exactly it. And I think Labour's inability to see that. My big what I found really surprising with this is Labour committed to an Ethics and Integrity Commission before the election about a year ago. They put no flesh on the bones on this. On day 2 of this, you could have turned around and said, look, this is an issue that we've all had. It's not just a Labour issue. Every single party has done this. They have. It's a kind of mini expenses scandal, and that's something the public didn't know about. Now they do, and they care about it. We think this is wrong. Here are the guidelines we're going to bring in. We're going to bring this Ethics and Integrity Commission in. We're going to take these steps. Frankly, we're going to do proper things around donations in politics, because it's the right thing to do, but also they don't have to say this publicly. For Labour, it's actually strategically the right thing to do as well.
But instead, it looks like Labour has kind of doubled down and kind of said, no, we're good people. Like you said, we're good people. We've done nothing wrong, and the public hates that, right? It
looks, because people go so for example, I was sitting on the train going to the Labour Party conference, and there was a couple sitting across from me, and it was they were doing something that you never see anymore, which is reading a newspaper. I know.
What was the newspaper?
It was the Mirror. Mm-hmm. And so this was interesting, and they were reading it together. And it was before conference. It was on the way. It was during conference, and the front page was Rachel Reeves talking. It was a tax policy, and they liked that, and they talked about it. They get a couple of pages in. It's Angela Rayner staying in Wahid Ali's flat in New York, and it's like a focus group. They're all the same. Look at this, etc., etc. And I think this is the problem. There's a kind of problem with seeing the perception of how and again, no rules have been broken. They haven't in this instance. I think it's very unlikely. But Labour seems to have not realised that to the public this looks bad, and also actually it is a problem having this level of having donors being this close to you is a problem. It isn't actually. There's a reason why this isn't good practice, and it does look like instead of winning the election, then okay, right, we need to have a Chinese wall. And there was a couple of stories before this that actually suggested things weren't great. There was a donor given £20,000 who was appointed into the Treasury. That's a real problem. And so there was already some of these things starting to happen. And I think this is the thing. I think Labour hasn't realised that this is not just a problem of Conservative sleaze. This is a problem of an access culture. And it's not just a problem of big PP contracts. It's more of a problem of how access works in our politics.
And how does that compare with how does that kind of structure of influence compare with the Tories and the Lib Dems now have a much bigger sort of footprint in Parliament? Is it easier to get to kind of influence the Labour Party with donations than it is the other two parties, or not really?
It's hard. This is the problem at the moment. It's very hard. It's kind of hard to know, actually. And the problem for Labour is now, because of the lens that is now being put on Labour, everything they do is now going to look like it's done through a lens. This is the thing where they I think Labour made a massive mistake, and they can still change this. The general election campaign, Labour understandably tried to raise as much money as they could, and they tried to raise it from rich people, and they changed their donation strategy intentionally. Under Ed Miliband, it wasn't just Jeremy Corbyn. Labour tended not just to get money from the unions, but it got a lot of small donations. Keir Starmer and Morgan McSweeney in particular decided to change that. That's a perfectly, you can see why you do it. At that stage, it looked like the Conservative Party, who've always outraised Labour from big donors since Tony Blair was out of office. We're going to raise a ton of money. And during the general election campaign, Labour did go hard and raised a ton of money. the Tories raised no money. It's really, to put it into context, they raised about 1/20th the amount of money they raised in the 2019 general election, the 2024 general election. No money at all. Nothing. They really struggled. A couple of £1 million. Like Labour, so one donor, like more than one donor gave Labour more money than the Tories raised in total. And so at that point, there's two ways you could go after the election, which is to go, do you know what? We could actually stop this system now if we wanted. We could put the brake on it. We could stop this. We could, because the Tories had also massively increased the spending limits, and also they've changed it. It's much easier to spend what's part of a national campaign locally. So before the general election last November, I wrote about it. I'm surprised so few people did. I think I was probably the only person who was writing about my Substack about this change. And Labour responded to that by trying to raise loads of money, thinking the Tories would succeed and do it. And afterwards, I think Labour had a real opportunity. I know people were talking to Labour about this, and I know that they were put under pressure by donors not to do this, to start thinking about how do we put the brakes on this? How do we take the money out of politics now? Do we talk about capping donations, which I think is a sensible thing? Do we talk about going back to the old spending limits? They've actually, as far as I can gather, none of that has been on the table at Labour. I think that's part of the problem. Had they been proactive on this issue, an issue where they'd been reminding, really, really vocal for a long time, then I think they could have taken a lot of sting out of this. But instead, they've not. So they're in a place where it looks as if all of their decisions, and I see it now, like I'm always quite careful to try and get the context around where donations are coming from. To some stories I don't report because I don't think the reporting and the framing is right. I don't think that's a problematic donation. But that lots of people don't do that, and lots of people aren't aware of that level of context. So it can quite easily go, you're doing this, you're doing carbon capture and storage because of X, Y, and Z. Whereas in some ways, it was a Tory policy. I have my problems with it, but it was a Tory policy, and they're just kind of continuing it. But now it looks like it's in light of all this money, which I don't see any evidence for. But the whole thing gets tarnished, and I think that's the bit. So and the party of government always attracts more money. Frankly, the Tory party, Tory candidates are still able to raise money, but increasingly actually from small numbers of very wealthy people who are clearly wanting to push them in certain directions. And the Liberal Democrats, I think because they've done so well, will probably continue to raise money too, probably from sectional interests who've got issues and there's still opportunities, like to maybe someone wants to get a peerage. Like this is how it works. Like frankly, this is
tip for listeners
if you want a peer. Oh God, if you want a peerage, the best way to do it is to give money to a party.
You've kind of said about this lens now being established towards Labour, and there'll be some genuine scandals probably, and there'll be some scandals that aren't really scandals. I mean, where do you think the big genuine scandals might emerge from? Where are the kind of vulnerabilities for the government going forwards?
I think there's a couple of things. I think one, as I say, like the reliance on big donors means you're reliant on who those donors are and what they've done, which you can't really control. You can't control what your donors do. You can try and pick them better. Like the Tories, by the end of the Tory administration, were really at the dregs of who would give you money. Mohammed Mansour, a former cabinet minister in Hosni Mubarak's government in Egypt, a man who made lots of money around the world. He became the Tory co-chairman and gave them millions of pounds. I'm not casting any aspersions on his character, but it's probably not the person you want to represent yourself as the party of Britain, shall we say. Labour's not in that place yet, but you can't really be beholden. You don't really know who your donors are in terms of, how much due diligence does anyone do? Parties don't do very much. They're not relied upon to do very much. The Electoral Commission rarely investigates. So that's one issue. I think this influence piece is a big thing. If you go into Labour Party conference, you have a lot of lobbying firms who are very attached to the Labour Party, very close to the Labour Party. Tony Blair, Peter Mandelson, Jim Murphy, all of these people who are very close. I think that's a problem for Labour. And it might just be a problem of perception, or it might be more than a problem of perception. But you can start to see it where you've got government policy, for example, in areas where companies were seconded into the opposition for a year, paid for by the company, which that happened to dozens of occasions. You can start to see where you've got problems there. You can start to see where your policy could start to be like, okay, who's calling the shots here? The Tony Blair Institute, for example, it's like AI is a solution to everything, and and that's what they're saying. They've got big donors who are helping them do that. When the government rolls out AI policy, people will say it's because Tony Blair Institute told you to, whether it is or it isn't. I think this is the problem for the Labour Party. They've got themselves in a problem of perception, but also potentially a bigger problem. And I think, and again, it's because they're not taking the decision to take the money out, they're taking the decision to try and keep, and they're going to keep fundraising. They will, and as you do that, especially as the party of power, history tells you, the Labour Party were full of scandals in Tony Blair's time. This isn't just a Conservative issue. Mm-hmm. This is a power issue. It's an issue of people want proximity to power.
But it's astonishing to think about the kind of the sense of naivety you get from the Labour government at the moment. I mean, before the election, there were so many think tank kind of policy wonks seconded to Labour to do work on policy from places like, let's say the Tony Blair Institute or various other think tanks. And of course, like that sort of, there was a story about Jonathan Reynolds having people from NatWest working as seconded into his team. It makes sense and it saves money for the party preparing. But also, of course, if you build that relationship with someone over many months of working with them, it's not, there must be a kind of some sort of an influence over your thinking. Otherwise, why would you bring them in to the party? That's why they're there doing that policy work.
I think that's the problem. So I did a story a couple of weeks ago with the Times and on my Substack about Shine, the Chinese company, and Shine are being represented. It's a huge story. Like what happened? Shine is kind of in some ways one of the biggest stories for like the City of London that's going to happen this year. For those who don't know, it's a huge company that you probably have heard of. You might have. They do online deliveries. It's clothes. It's fast fashion. It's incredibly cheap. They tried to list on the London stock and the New York Stock Exchange. They ran into regulatory troubles, partly to do with their supply chain and accusations of forced labour in Xinjiang and Uyghur labour in the supply chain. They're now in London. It's a big issue. It's a big, whether they get listed in the LSE, there's a lot of pressure coming from the London Stock Exchange to have them listed. Before the election, Rachel Reeves came out with a very specific policy proposal. At a time when there wasn't a specific policy proposal, saying they weren't going to change this specific tax loophole that Shine are able to not, basically they don't have to pay import duty because they ship things from outside of the UK. Okay. There's a lot of people in the clothing industry who really don't like that because they see it as an unfair advantage. The decision was taken that Labour weren't going to change that. And Labour at the same time also said that they were broadly indicated supportive of Shine listing. Shine are represented by a lobbying firm called FGS Global. One of FGS Global's partners was unpaid advisor to Rachel Reeves during the general election, and as we wrote about in the Times, is still an unpaid advisor to Rachel Reeves, and is still, is connected to this. Her firm represents Shine. You can see the potential there for problems. And even if nothing, how are we to know?
It looks bad, right?
It looks bad, and it's a problem.
Of all the companies, it's a fast fashion company which surely wouldn't align with like either Labour values or kind of climate ambitions. It's all not good.
all of this is problematic, and I think that's the bit where there isn't I feel like that isn't being seen by Labour. They don't see how, and this is kind of like, these are accidents waiting to happen. These are problems that are there, and that's going to be a big decision. It's a bit like the football regulator. This is the bit about conflicts of interest. This is going to be a big decision. We're going to have to make a decision one way or the other. That decision can then be seen in light of things like this, even if those have no influence whatsoever, even if there's no bearing brought to play at all. The perception exists.
There's another story here too, right? That there was some research done, I think, by the New Statesman around the time of the election, that the new intake of Labour MPs has the highest number of lobbyists, than the party's ever had. That's not just registered lobbyists, but that might also be in-house lobbyists for various organisations. So you've got a lot of MPs who are kind of familiar with that kind of work and maybe comfortable with it. Do you think that could be somehow do you think that's an issue for Labour?
I think it is. I think it speaks to a wider thing in our politics. I think it speaks another thing about this closed political economy, where people go and they work maybe for an MP, and then they become a lobbyist, and then they get a PPS job.
Back and forth.
They go back and forth. And I think the revolving door thing is definitely an issue, because they're revolving into this same small political economy and kind of jumping out the other side. And I think this is part of the problem, because you then have ministers or people making decisions who might have worked for a lobbying firm who's got an interest in this area, etc., etc. And I think this is, And also because our lobbying laws are so bad. So like the reason why I was able to write about Shine was because no one had written about it. It was actually really hard to find out that the FGS Global was working for Shine. It was only a press release I just came across a couple of months ago that told me that. It hadn't been in the public domain. It could easily not have been. And this is part of the problem too. Because we often cannot tell what's happening because our lobbying laws are so bad. You really end up in this position where like there's a public interest in putting information into the public domain. And so you also get this kind of double whammy where you don't actually know what's happening. And I think the Labour haven't really kind of understood, I think, how that connection with the lobbying industry is potentially a problem for them. And I think it is because of this Labour family thing. Because a lot of these firms are firms, you know, and it was striking, like the lobbying industry is like Caddy, like they all set up Labour units about 2 years ago. They started bringing people in who were close to Labour. And then given the way the party was changing, then you're actually in a really good place to end up on a shortlist, a candidate shortlist. A candidate shortlist we now know that involved, you know, someone from Wahid Ali's office being involved. You can start to see how this all looks very cosy.
Yeah, absolutely.
As you kind of go on following this story, these stories within kind of that bigger issue, what's your process going to be? How are you going to try and uncover these connections and tell people about that relationship?
I think it is that thing. I think, as I say, it is about trying to find out what's happening, put these stories in context. As a journalist, like I use all the different methods of journalism. That's my nature. I use everything from talking to sources, using official documents, using freedom of information laws. All of those things are things that are kind of in my toolkit. People coming to me with stories, you know. Anyone's out there? Oh, my DMs are always open. Actually, don't. Twitter I hate. Email me. Or subscribe to my Substack and respond. But generally though, like it is about all those different tools and like looking at what's happening. And as I say, like I was surprised how relevant all these things are. You know, I kind of found myself having loads of conversations about this in the middle of this year, thinking actually some of this stuff might become relevant down the line. But actually it is. I think there is still a big piece of accountancy journalism around keeping track of what's happening. And as well as that, specifically trying to put it in context, trying to see, okay, what is happening here? That takes time, actually. Like at the moment you can start to see, okay, there's some potential problems, but actually what's happened. And a lot of my work is often about I often call myself news adjacent. It's not being necessarily led by the news agenda. It's like sitting to the side of it and thinking about, okay, what's happening? And often my part of my job is going backwards. What happened at that instance? And like, how can I work backwards to see what was going on at the time a decision was made or something was happening? Yeah.
Is there anything that you think our listeners, like non-journalists, can do to kind of save democracy from this, you know?
I think getting engaged, like I do find myself, I'm a journalist, I'm not a campaigner, but the thing I do find myself thinking about a lot is about this issue of money in our politics. It's something that people care about. We know from talking to people they care about it. And it's kind of something that's not represented because, you know, someone, I can't remember who it was, a politician said to me when I was writing my book, because I spoke to loads of politicians for my book, and they said, like, it's a broken system, but we all feel like we know how to use it. And the general election is 650 mini general elections. So everyone who's got elected feels like the system's kind of worked for them. And so there's not much interest in changing it. And I think it's one of those issues that actually there isn't much of a cohort in politics around. You know, there isn't really a consolidation of people. There's different people in different parties who I do think care deeply about this issue, and I talk to lots of them, and it is a kind of cross party. But it's not a commonality of a party. You wouldn't go, this party will all agree on this issue because this is where they stand. It isn't. And I think in the absence of that, and because it directly affects politicians, you're in this strange space where the public want something, the public want change, but there isn't a constituency in Parliament to deliver change. And I don't know how they go about it, but I do think there's something about trying to coalesce, trying to find ways to take these issues and bring them together in a way that actually politicians do have to go, okay, I can see this. What are the 2 or 3 big messages that the public are telling us on this? Because at the moment they're in a space where they're able to kind of go, oh, it's silly, this is stuff about glasses, and they're kind of able to avoid seeing what's the big meta issue here. And that to me is a really interesting thing about all of this.
So really quick final question, because you just mentioned the glasses. Do you think is the issue with the glasses the Labour peer who bought the glasses and his connection, or is there an issue in a Prime Minister just receiving kind of luxurious gifts on the face of that? Is that a problem? Is that democracy for sale or not really?
I think it is problematic. I think you end up in a problematic space. If you in America, this is what I think, like, America's a funny place. I find myself increasingly going, well, actually, I wrote, this is slightly tangential, but I wrote in that LRB piece about how Labour Together was Britain's first super PAC, which I sitting here the day after the end of Sue Gray, I think is really true. But actually, super PACs do have some regulations, and you can actually find out about them. You can't here in the UK.
By the day after Sue Gray, by the way, it's the day after Sue Gray has resigned.
Oh, yeah, sorry.
Position.
Yes, my apologies. The day after Sue Gray has resigned from her position. In America, it's $99 is the limit you can take as a free gift of the value of something. At The Guardian, I think it's about £25. They've got a sleaze bucket where you have to chuck stuff into if it gets over £25. So I think thinking about those things, companies like in the private sector, you can't, like, this would start to get into corruption issues. If you were in the private sector and you were doing this, you'd be in a problem. If you say you're a subcontractor and you took luxurious meals from a subcontractor, you'll be in a difficult position. I think applying that, I think we really need to is apply the same smell test that you would see in other walks of life to politics.
Peter, thank you so much for joining us. If you want to read more from Peter, you can subscribe to his Substack.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, guys.